Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mamluks podcast. My name is Sim. Along with me are my co-hosts, Sheikh Amir and Mort. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.
We have a wonderful show for you guys this evening, but before we get started, help us out on patreon.com/the Mamluks. This operation requires your help and allows us to afford nice little decoration pieces around the studio. Did you see the Decepticons logo, Sheikh? What do you think about that?
I think it's beautiful. I like the color too.
It matches your character. You're deceptive.
I like the idea of being, the bad boys of Islam.
The bad boys. Is there such thing?
Speak for yourself.
All right, let's restart everything. Sorry, guests. There's no such thing as bad boys. We don't believe in that, guys.
He's the bad boy.
Are there skateboards? Are there skateboards at the back there?
Those are snowboards.
Yeah, snowboards.
Snowboard, okay.
And then he's got the Magneto helmet in the back. Maybe you can explain to him why you chose Magneto.
Magneto was like, when they made the X-Men, they made Professor X like Martin Luther King and Magneto as Malcolm X. So there are two different leaders representing a minority. And I always liked Magneto because he represented Malcolm X, at least from the writer's perspective of the show. So he always wanted them to have their own homeland where they can have their own laws, kind of like how we want our own Islamic homeland, right? So Magneto was, he said, you know what, mutants will live separately from the human beings, from the Homo sapiens, in their own asteroid called Asteroid M. Yeah. And that's the story behind that.
That was pretty cool.
That's actually a good way to kind of segue into what we were speaking about.
Wait. But we got to wish the listeners happy
birthday?
Happy Milad.
Oh, Milad al-Nabi. Oh.
Chef, did you celebrate?
You started celebrating that now?
No, I didn't.
I didn't, bro. You know what the problem is?
But you don't say it though, right? So
I am, but I forget. I always forget when the Milad is, and usually, I have a birthday calendar.
Look at his face.
On Google, and my Google birthday.
Google alert?
Yeah, I usually have a birthday calendar with you, people like you and everyone
birthday today.
where I know when to wish people a happy birthday. But then Mort's birthday is around this time of year too, and you don't want
it was October 11th. Actually.
You don't want the prophet's birthday next to a degenerate like him.
That's true.
And then it's just it seems out of place,
It lost its significance, is what he's trying to say. But I'm glad I was the reason you didn't celebrate this year. Because my birthday protected you from a bid'ah, so that's good.
Hang on, let me sort this out. But Mort, go ahead and segue into the
So I mean, since Sim was just mentioning about this whole Magneto thing and separation of states and having our own community, I think one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to get this show together was because there was a post by Sheikh Harfouch al-Hajj, regarding I haven't had a chance to actually read the whole thing, but it stirs some controversy about how Muslims should actually find or bring about change, and should they work within the system. The gist of it is, should they work within the system or is it possible to even do that? Meaning, I think there was an implication that it would be impossible to do it any other way. Meaning that right now this is what we have, and that we'd have to utilize this current secular system and values in order to, in a nice way, infiltrate and then change it from within. And I think that stirred a lot of controversy, not necessarily because it was him alone, but it's been many people. Exactly. It's been many people that have shared this sentiment over the past. It's growing number of them over the past few decades, and they're kind of redefining what the political activism meant in the Islamic communities. And I think that's why it was a good time to have this show.
The show, and we wanted to show with two prominent former guests of ours who we've discussed this with. Brother Uthman Badar out of Australia. He is. What are you up to these days? You were. I remember you were going after your PhD, and I don't know if you ended up completing that.
Yeah, I think last time was it 18 or 19. I was starting at that point.
Yeah.
And now, 3 years on, I'm close to the finish. But I've learned the hard way that close to the finish of the PhD can go on for a longer time than you expect. So yeah, I'm probably about 6 months off.
Or we still gotta wait?
No, you can't do that right now. It's not.
Let's just call you doctor. We'll get it over with.
Dr. Brother? I like how that sounds.
Yeah, me too. I have a cousin by the way named Badar. We call him Dr.
He just
Badar
said
too,
don't call him that, guys. Look how uncomfortable he is right now.
No.
But you know what? I will say this much, though. No offense, but Ali is an American, so we kind of lean to the American side.
Yeah. Our other guest today is
I'm just kidding.
Brother Ali Harfouch, someone who I deeply respect and admire, as well as Uthman. Both previous guests of ours discussed many topics related to Islamic governance, and I just thought that there's no better people that, at least regarding from our former guests, to discuss the subject. So welcome to the show, fellas. Ali, you got to talk so that the Zoom shows your face.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Just say hi.
Thank you for having me.
That's awesome. And you guys, your most recent show, Mort, you were on with him, right? That was like 6 months ago, maybe?
Yeah. With Ali, yeah. Yes, sir. I didn't have a chance to join with Uthman, but with Ali I was joining. I think Maheen was with Uthman.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start things off just by discussing a little bit about why secularism and this subject, because people, we want to make sure that this episode is available or accessible for any demographic in any level of Islam that you're at. So how does secularism pertain to our belief, and why is it so important that we are discussing this subject? I think that's something I wanted to kind of hash out in the beginning, then we can kind of delve a little bit more deeper into some of the more complex subject matter.
And eventually the post, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Ali, you want to go first?
Yeah, no worries, Akhi.
Yeah,
so the fact of the matter is, that we live in a secular age, right? We live in a secular age where certain modes of thinking, certain sensibilities, certain hopes and aspirations are defined and determined by what we call secularism as a political doctrine, or the secular, or secularity, and so forth, right? These are all essentially terms which point towards the same thing. So as Muslims living in a secular age, right, we need to be able to understand what exactly secularism is, right? How does it operate, and how has it permeated and shaped the way Muslims think and navigate the world? And not just the way Muslims think and navigate the world, but even shaping the sensibilities of Muslims, shaping certain hopes and aspirations, and essentially limiting other horizons of thought, limiting us or preventing us from thinking about other sorts of possibilities and so forth. So it's essential that we kind of go back and understand what exactly is secularism.
Yeah, so let's, at least from what we learn in American schools and stuff, we define secularism as a segregation between church and state, that religion is not part of the state apparatus, and that it's not the source of legislation. But I think there's a gray area as well, because the morals of a people in a democratic society are derived from their religious place or their religious inclinations, and hence that kind of transfers into the legislative process, and problems happen, like the controversial subjects related to abortion and so on. So how do we understand the secular model after the fall of the Ottoman Empire? We've kind of relegated Islam to a more a secular space, and I think even more religious places like Saudi Arabia and stuff, they've kind of had certain aspects of the Sharia, but it's not a very comprehensive implementation of Islam, because many people in the West will say, well, look at Saudi Arabia or Iran, etc., as theocratic models where religion is not, where religion is a source of legislation. So expand on that a little bit.
Go ahead, Uthman.
Yeah, that's actually a good sort of point to start on, because I think what makes this discussion one way to make this discussion beneficial or instructive is to think about how secularism is imagined or thought to be, both by theorists, political theorists, political philosophers, but also more popularly in the West, how it's thought to be, and then line that up with how we might understand it. And in fact, how it's, for the last, I would say about 30 years, within the academy, it's being critiqued, has been critiqued. And that's why I say this is a good place to start, because, you know, this juxtaposition of theocracy as an imposing form of politics that imposes one way of life onto everyone living in that state, and is very, unfair, because how can you impose a religion or any ideology on people that don't believe in it, right? That's juxtaposed in the popular imagination with secularism, which is a way of life that merely separates religion from the state, allowing everyone to, follow their own religion in their private lives, as a way of fairly managing diversity. We live in diverse societies. That means we live in societies where people follow different religions, different ideologies, no religion, atheism, everything, right? So secularism is thought of being a way to fairly manage that diversity, because what it does is, in the liberal imagination again, it brackets or backgrounds controversial worldviews, and it foregrounds what we would call neutral epistemology and politics, a procedural politics, right? Which basically means everyone can keep your sort of controversial Activa theology, ideology at home, bring your opinions into the public sphere, debate them, express your views. That will sort of filter into the parliament, and the parliament will debate those and legislate. So that in this way, everyone is the demos is everyone's engaged in that process, and we are sort of doing self-rule. And that way it's not an imposing way of, that's how it's imagined. In fact, however, what I would argue is that it's really not secularism is no less imposing than any form of theocracy. And I think if we can unpack that today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought some excellent points about this, because there are some ideas that are, they're superimposed, that democracy or secularism, I would say, is something that is tolerant, it is opposite of oppression, it's liberal thought, it's inclusive, whereas everything else is suppressive, it's dominating, it's authoritarian, it's theocratic, it's draconian, right? They kind of associate these labels to it. But I guess the main point is to break it down what he was saying in theory and practice, like theoretically versus practically, right? Theoretically, people have these utopian ideas about what it meant to be, the Enlightenment, and this is what it's supposed to do. And what I'm really interested in is that how this experiment worked while it was for a set group of people, like when it was a group of French or a group of Anglo-Saxons. The minute you have a different group of people come in, or different religion, different background, how quickly that becomes a point of contention. It's no longer this homogenous society that agrees on these collective values that they agree of are good, because again, this goes back to the main point, was the way they derive their morality and things like that is entirely subjective, because they've taken it away from their original core, which was their religion. And they associate that, like Christianity, with all religions, and that it being oppressive, and they move away from it, and they have this subjective opinion now about what is morality, what are rules, ethics. But whereas Muslims or maybe practicing people of different religions will come in and say, no, our morality is not subjective, it's objective. Our views are objective. And so how do you marry that in a secular society? It becomes very, very difficult.
Yeah.
It does.
Well, one of the reasons why this is so important to understand, because if you look through the history of human history, the ideas of anyone get disseminated through the adoption of a government apparatus, right? Governance models who are ingesting ideas, the prevailing ideas of that time, and spreading it, right? So we know for a fact, it's not necessarily, when you agree to this idea that government apparatuses, governance models spread ideas, you're not saying that Islam is necessarily equating that to Islam. It's a matter of fact. It's not necessarily that you're saying that you're agreeing to the caliphate or anything like that. We're agreeing to this fundamental premise when you're discussing the spread of ideas, whether you call it dawah or the spread of freedom and democracy or whatnot. You need to understand that the government apparatus, a governance model, will exponentially increase ideas throughout the world.
Product of your environment.
Yeah, because of the various state institutions that are geared towards the propagation of those ideas.
Yeah, and it's what controls your heart, right?
Yeah.
If you're governed by something, that's what your heart begins to gravitate towards.
Exactly. If I can just jump in here and kind of build on the point that you're making about the state, and kind of link that to this definition of secularism as being the separation of church and state. Now, this idea that secularism is merely the separation of church and state is essentially a secular definition of secularism, right? And this idea that secularism seeks to foster tolerance is also a secular definition of secularism. So what happens, and this is one of the problems in the Muslim world, is that we are engaging and we are trying to critique secularism, but on secularism's own terms, right? Whereas if we think critically, right, we would need to begin, which I hope we can do in this session, inshallah, like Uthman said, is to kind of unpack, okay, what is, like Uthman said, what does the secular state do in practice? This is critical, right? What is the state doing in practice? And this is what Sim was alluding to, right? That the state actually has a significant role in enforcing secularism and secular sensibilities and so forth. So unpacking secularism, not on the terms that it forces on us, right? But unpacking secularism in practice, unpacking the history of secularism, right? The genealogy of secularism, but just as importantly, especially for us as Muslims, in defining secularism, we need to also unpack for lack of a better word, the Activa of secularism, right? The foundational assumptions or the metaphysical assumptions that inform this idea of the separation of church and state, right? And why is this important? Because secularists or secular theorists like to pretend that there is no metaphysics, that there's no Aqidah to the secular state, right? That it is somehow it has matured beyond metaphysics. And when I say metaphysics, it sounds like a fancy word. It merely means our conception of God, man, and God-man relations. So these are the things that we need to unpack rather than defining secularism on its own terms as merely being the church and separation of the church and state.
So Ali, why don't we start with that first? Let's talk about the Aqidah, because a lot of times people will say that, at least this is my perspective, that they will come out and say that, oh, secularism is pretty much devoid of religion. It's kind of, it has no religion, it has no God, it's simply, silent on the issue. Yeah. But I think when we as Muslims who reflect on the Quran, we actually see, no, they actually do have a religion. They do actually have a God, and that is their desires, right? They've chosen something as an ilah over their creator. And so that's how I look. When I initially look at secularism, I look at people who follow the shahawat, right? And so maybe you can explain, maybe in the history, if you want to go down the history, or maybe unpack just the aqidah, quote unquote, of the secular movement and the ideas. Maybe we can start there and then kind of unpackage how that affects us from the core.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. So there's a relationship between the history of secularism and the metaphysics of secularism, right? Why is there a relationship between the history and the metaphysics or the aqidah? Because essentially secularism is linked to the project that we call modernity. And modernity has always been this ongoing process of trying to develop a new image of the world, right? A new image of the world in a so-called post-Christian world, right? So trying to rethink God, man, and man-God relations. So we can think of secularism as a sort of orientation to the question of man-God relations. In particular, I think the core and quintessential theme of the secular aqidah, of the secular metaphysics, is that it reoccupies, right, or it shifts from the idea of the sovereignty of God to the sovereignty of the world, to the sovereignty of the temporal world, which is what the word secular essentially means, right? This worldly, or referring to a particular temporal time period and so forth. So the core metaphysical assumption of the secular worldview or of modernity, in trying to break away from, in some ways, trying to break away from Christianity, although its relationship to Christianity is actually far more complex. One way to understand secular metaphysics is this idea of the sovereignty of the world, which, as for Muslims, we don't believe in the sovereignty of the world, right? We believe in the sovereignty of Allah in terms of His cosmic sovereignty, His creatorship, and we also believe in the sovereignty of Allah in the temporal and legislative sense. And we regard the world to be a dunya. We don't regard the world to be something that has a sense of ultimacy or something that is transcendental or that has the property of transcendence and so forth. So I would say when you want to understand the core metaphysical assumption of the core aqidah of secularism and the history of secularism, it is essentially this the sovereignty of the world.
I just wanted to bring up one point too. I think in the beginning you mentioned, I think it's really important. To me, it almost seems that secularism, which came about really from, in my understanding, from near the Enlightenment era, right? This whole push against Christianity. Like, it was born out of this rebellion to a oppressive Christian rule, and they took this idea that, well, if Christianity is this way, all other religions who have forms of governance would be the same way. They lumped all the religions together, and then in that assumption, they formed this, what they call Enlightenment era, where they just kind of challenged everything. Like, meaning that, as he mentioned, there's no sovereignty. I mean, they took away, they tried to take away in their minds the sovereignty of God and put it into other things. Whereas, so would you say that in a lot of ways that secularism is a response to the oppressive, tyrannical, authoritarian rule of maybe Christendom?
Okay, so I'll just say one thing, inshallah ta'ala, and then I'll delegate this question to Uthman. So one of the narratives that secularism tries to put forth, especially secularism in its modern forms, is that we have somehow matured beyond Christianity and religion and superstition. Mm-hmm. And what is left and what has been distilled from this act of maturing, right, this moving into adulthood, is secular rationality. Mm-hmm. The reality is far more complex, right? In many ways, you can argue that secularism is not a counter response to Christianity, but in certain respects is a continuity of Christianity in certain respects. So one of the fundamental processes, right, that gave birth to our secular age are certain Christian movements, religious movements like the Reformation, for example, in Europe. Right, for example, and Charles Taylor in his book A Secular Age brilliantly traces this continuity between certain aspects of Christianity and the modern secular age. So we should not uncritically accept this narrative that that the West has somehow matured beyond Christianity and accepted secular rationality and so forth, as though it has moved into adulthood. The relationship between Christianity and secularism is actually far more complex than that.
Yeah, great. I want to turn to Uthman. Uthman, did you want to add anything on the origins of like this secular thought and idea, and maybe kind of where it was born out of in terms of a reaction to maybe something that was perceived as oppressive or authoritarian, or maybe even it was. I don't know. Maybe you want to add something on that note.
Yeah, look, that argument that's the secular sort of self-representation, that this is a response to oppression, and in that sense, obviously, it's progressive. So if it's a response to oppression, we're moving forward, right? But I find Talal Assad's argument compelling that secularism emerges instrumentally with and for the modern nation state, and specifically for the modern nation state's consolidation of power. You see, and that's a very different way of looking at it than saying this is about. That doesn't mean within that there wasn't pushback against church excesses. Obviously there were, but that whole history of, you know, the religious wars, the wars of religion and the church and Reformation, it's quite complicated, although definitely part of the picture. But really, at base, I would argue that secularism, the primary motivation for secularism is the modern nation state is emerging, and it's dealing with constituencies that need to be what's sort of standardized, you know, really conquered in a way, subordinated, right? And so one of the things you need to do is you've got these Protestants, you've got these Catholics, they are fighting, they've got issues. What do? Well, let's bracket religion, right? But also assert the primacy of secular ways of thinking and secular ways of politics.
So let's pause it for a second. What if somebody comes back and tells you and says, well, listen, we live in a modern age. We've got people that have all these different backgrounds. If we allow, I mean, I'm going to play the devil's advocate and say, well, what if America retained, or England, or whatever it may be, other colonies retained the Christian identity, and they wanted to push back on Muslims or other religions or minorities that were there based on the fact that they are the majority and that Christianity is the be-all, end-all for them. How would that turn out for other people? Like, would we like that if that happened to us, essentially? So how would you approach, how tackle that argument that many people would make?
Yeah, that's really good. So that's effectively what is said. That's effectively the understanding that the alternative to secularism is some form of theocracy or some form of either theocracy or communism. Right, some secular ideology that is equally imposing. But the way to approach that is to say, okay, hang on a minute, let's think through what secularism is, and to show that in fact it's just a different form of imposition, because you simply cannot have a neutral politics, which is another way of saying what Imran was getting to with the state pushing ideas and the rest of it. Another way of saying that simply is you can't have neutral politics. You can't have neutral governance like from nowhere. We've got no controversial opinions or positions from which we're managing the world. So what if we can show, this is the point, if we can show, which I think we can fairly easily, that secularism is a different form, and here I know some people sort of collapse secularism and religion by saying it's a new form of religion, it's another form of religion. I don't like to do that. I like to look at it as a normative power in its own terms, sufficiently unique. But it's imposing. Think about how Muslims live now. So you're saying, well, what if America was Christian, and how would Muslims feel? Well, how do Muslims feel now, living under liberal secular democracy? You guys having a great time? Yeah. You know, are you really equal to the majority?
Well, I could argue certainly better than under Charles Martel. I mean, you know what I mean? They could argue that.
Who's that? Who's Charles Martel?
Oh, you know, the guy who was a crusader who pushed against the Muslims and pushed them out of Europe. I mean, you know, he was okay. There's a difference within, for example, secular democracy between a Trump and, you know, Obama, for example, or others. You're gonna get people who are much more like directly violent or directly suppressive and otherwise. But the question in origin is secularism an ideology in its own right, or is it not? Right, because then I can come back and say, well, sure, okay, Christendom in parts of it was suppressive in that more stark way, but Islam wasn't. Right.
You know, Christians living under Islam weren't. Sometimes there were. I'd argue that was the exception, but it wasn't. So you can't generalize and say, well, religion leads to this.
Yeah.
Right. You know, Hitler and Stalin are not religious ideologues by any stretch.
Right.
Right. Although they may have used religion, that happens even today.
Yeah.
But so in other words, you can get that more violent form of suppression in both secular and religious forms of governance. So that's not a distinguishing point.
Right.
This is the question: what's the distinguishing point between the two? Is it really the fact that one has a thick normativity, has a sort of thick ideology about the world, and then it becomes imposing on others, whereas the other one doesn't? No. So this is the point. If we can establish that they're both imposing, now the discussion changes. Now you can't justify this You can't justify secularism just on the basis of saying, well, you guys adopt a controversial worldview. We've been debating theology for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not going to be resolved. Let's put that to the side. Or when you put that to the side, what are you bringing to the center?
Right.
As Ali said, it's just a different form of metaphysics or God-man relations. Or
I mean, one of the troubling things I see with the whole idea of secular idea that it's this they painted this picture as if it's some monolithic idea that everybody agrees on what it means to be secular, and they don't. Like if you look at secularism in America, what that means to an American and what that means to a Frenchman, it's entirely different, completely different, right? Their idea of liberalism is something almost anti-religion. Whereas maybe someone who claims to be liberal or secular in America would say, I don't really care about religion at all. I don't really care what you do. One area has, which is the irony in it to me, because secularism is supposed to be something which says the state is silent, or the powers that be are silent on what religion is or anything about religion. But yet we see a French government today specifically making laws and legislation about religion. Right, so you kind of look at these examples and say, well, what if the purpose was to not have someone infringe on religion, enforce any type of religion, whether for or against religion, then what are you truly accomplishing here? And what I think from this, what I can tell is that these ideas of secularism and these secular laws and progressive values, whatever they call them, they worked when there was a homogenous society and people generally were born out of a similar culture. Whether that be Christendom, whether it be Jude, whatever you want to say, wherever it was, and even in India, the Hinduism, when they have a collective value that they all understood, which was instilled into them by their previous religions, or they kind of agreed, like these low-key laws: don't murder, don't rape, don't have, don't traditionally. Like you look at America, don't go dating and stuff. These were traditional things they had. But the minute you have someone that came in and challenged that and said, no. These are we have different rules than you. Then this cohesivity behind this secular thought just crumbles away, and I think that's where we are right now, where we're really testing it now. Is it feasible for everybody? Because you want to achieve this idea of what's that word? Pluralism and these ideas, but is it really capable of providing that? And I think what we're seeing now is that it's not. And if it's not capable of doing that, then why do we put it as a standard?
Is there a mechanism built in secularism that is more inclined towards liberalism and the shedding of traditional values? Do you guys, maybe Ali can comment on this, do you feel that there is some inherent nature within secularism that sheds traditional values and whatever has spread within, whatever moral code has spread within societies, it tries to get rid of, or do you think that it's something more deeper than that?
So there's no doubt, right, that So let's begin with this. Liberalism, right, or liberal politics and so forth, is a continuity. It was born out of secularism, right? It was born out of secular sensibilities, and it was born out of a secular metaphysics. So there is a continuity between secularism and the liberal order and the neoliberal order that dominates today. And essentially, and this is where the Islamic critique can come in, and where the Muslim intervention can come in, is that usually when we debate liberalism and what is liberalism and so forth, we tend to ignore its secular background. So usually people who launch critiques, like conservatives who critique liberalism and the liberal order, do not critique the secular background and the secular metaphysics, because they've already absorbed and they've already accommodated secular sensibilities and secular metaphysics and so forth. So to understand liberalism, you have to understand, of course, the metaphysics and so forth.
So have Muslims done that same thing, though? Have Muslims accommodated secularism within their own psyche?
Okay, so my argument essentially would be that unfortunately we have on multiple levels. And in order to understand what it means to absorb secularism, we have to understand that the secular operates on on two levels, right? So when we speak of the secular or secularism, we're not just talking about an intellectual system of beliefs or ideas that you can distill or that you can infer from the books of Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, and so forth, right? Secularism also operates at the level of what we can call, of what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary, meaning our hopes, our aspirations, our sensibilities, how we feel and how we make sense of the world, and the language that we employ in describing and understanding the world. So the secular permeates the very psyche, as you put it, of the Muslim world by furnishing a certain sense of a certain subjectivity, a certain sensibility. And sometimes at the level of intellectual thought and at the level of theory, we might espouse certain anti-secularist ideas. But at the level of our sensibilities and at the level of our hopes and aspirations and our use of language and discourse, we are still confined and imprisoned within this secular cage and so forth. Now, I want to link this, how secularism operates on these two levels, to the point that you made earlier, the point that was made earlier about why there's a difference of opinion in terms of what constitutes the secular and what constitutes the religious. The very fact that these two categories are contested, right? What does it mean to be secular, right? Is it the American Judeo-Christian model or is it the French model? The very fact that what does it mean to be secular is contested goes to show that the secular and the so-called religious are not two universal categories that emerged out of Europe and that can be imposed on the world. The reality is that it is the secular state which determines what constitutes the secular and what constitutes religious. And it is the secular state that defines essentially what is a good religion that is compatible with the values of the state, and what is a bad religion which needs to be repressed and banished from the public sphere. Now, why is this important, and how is it related to how Muslims have come to absorb secularism? It is related to it because what this essentially means is that the secular state is always involved in the active process of intervening and transforming the citizen, transforming the subject, transforming our subjectivities, right? So essentially taking religion, right, and transforming it so that religion meets the sensibilities and the precepts of the state. So this involves the transformation of the individual, right, at the level of the thought and at the level of his sensibilities. It involves the transformation of the community, and it involves the transformation of the relationship between the individual and the community, and more importantly, the story that the community tells about itself, the narrative that it tells about itself. So there's a direct relationship between how Muslims have come to adopt these secular values, right, on the one hand, and the active role of the secular state in intervening into the public sphere and essentially cultivating these secular values.
I want to ask you a question about this. So I guess this is more in terms of how people like Muslims would critique the idea, the notion that secularism is superior. And one of the ways that I found, and I wanted to also get your take, and the reason why, I'll explain why I'm asking this question, but one thing I found is that a lot of the arguments around secularism are made to appeal to emotions, because you mentioned certain people like that talk about the freedom of expression, appeals to you, your inner nature, these things. It's very emotional, the connection here. And that also, in turn, applies to what they deem to be permissible and impermissible. Like, for example, and just to break it down in layman's terms, like the right to love, my body, my choice. These kinds of things are rooted in emotional ideas that, oh, how dare you tell me what to do? The individualistic idea is that, hyper-individualism. And one of the critiques that I have is that, well, as a Muslim, I believe that these laws and morality that we have is objective. And it's perfect because it is objective. Whereas you have something that is subjective where it can change at a minute's notice depending on people's popular opinion that day or that month or that week or that year, right? But I think one of the, and generally the argument then does tend to provoke thought, but my question is now regarding this. You'll find some people that say, listen, we agree with what you're saying, Ali, that yes, there's problems with how secularism was brought about, and it's not perfect, and it has these problems, and it appeals to these things, these different natures. But however, the key difference is that we can work with it, meaning we can cancel certain things and revitalize it. We can revamp it. We can add ideas, subtract ideas, and we can kind of cater it. Yeah. Right? Yeah, we can cater it to fit. But it's this large experiment where we can live and learn, and then find out what's good for humanity, and then add to it and subtract what we don't like from it. Whereas what you're calling for, or what you may believe in, is fixed. And so I find that oftentimes a lot of Muslims may get stuck in this argument. They try to then fall for this trap that no, we're also this way too. We can, change parts of this thing, and not. That's why you have this whole reformist idea now within Islam, like the reformist or secular movement or whatever. But how would you tackle this whole notion of what you have is fixed and what we have is, it may be problematic, but it's workable. We can tweak it to fit our to be perfect.
So at two levels, you can critique this idea at two levels. So first of all, in practice, this is an untenable idea. Whether you call whether the state refers to its values through the word objective or the word subjective, in reality, it is imposed through law. It is imposed through a series of state institutions, and there is no better example of this than in the United States and its so-called war on terror and its promotion of religious freedom, where in reality it is just promoting a secular theological agenda and trying to reshape the hearts and minds of the Muslim world in the name of freedom of expression and so forth. So it doesn't really matter if you refer to your values, your secular values, as being objective or subjective, right? The reality is that power and state power enforces and imposes a certain life form on you, right? Irrespective of your claims about those values and so forth. In theory, secularism is not based on, in liberalism, it's not based on a set of quote unquote subjective ideas, right? Secularism and liberalism make objective claims about the nature of man, about the relationship between man and God, and our relationship to the world. Right, so there is a metaphysics that secularism and liberalism holds to be uncontestable and that holds to be objectively true, as we spoke about earlier.
Can you give an example of what a secularist, a hardcore secularist, would claim as objective about the relationship between man and God? Like, what's an example of what they would say about that?
So here you have two schools, right? You have the hardline, or we can refer to it in a different way. You have the early Enlightenment and the late Enlightenment thinkers. The late Enlightenment thinkers would argue, for example, that there is no relationship between man and God, quite simply because this transcendental and this supreme being does not exist, right? So they espouse a materialist relationship a materialist and naturalistic approach to the world and so forth. The more early Enlightenment thinkers espouse this idea of deism, providential deism and so forth, which states something along the lines that God is a sort of Aristotelian watchmaker who is independent and causally uninvolved in the world and so forth. And so essentially man is left according to his own devices, whether it's through natural law, the logos and reason and so forth, to try to discover what is moral, what is ethical and so forth. So essentially, these are considered to be two uncontestable truths, and then political, economic, and social philosophy basically just branches out of those core, objective, uncontestable assumptions, and so forth. That's why it's critical that when we're engaging with secularism, we engage with these hidden assumptions. We engage with these unquestioned assumptions, and so forth.
A quick note is that, just for listeners, if you want to know more about deism, we did an episode on that 168 with Brother Bassam Zawadi. check that out.
Yeah, and just real quick, just to kind of help some of the listeners understand, some of these concepts are like foreign to some of these people. So just to break it down, what they're saying is secularists will tell you, what he's saying is that they have these conditions they've already set forth as facts. And they're not necessarily facts, but they assume they're facts. And they start their premise initially based on that. And so one of them being that God is independent of the world. There could be a God, but if there is one, he's completely independent of the world. He has no control over everything that's happening. You're left to your own.
He created it and left everything be.
And there's the other thought he's saying that says that there is no God. It's just an imagination. It's just the way humans use. It's a coping thing, right? And so there's really no super being. And so ultimately, at the end, they both are pushing the idea that God has no control. I mean, there's no such thing as God having control over anything. And so then, therefore, you're left to your own ideas, and that's why you need to do X, Y, and Z, because it's up to us to decide now, right? And so that's the whole point. That I think what the brother's mentioning now is that, if you want to really tackle, you have to first tackle that idea that the first two. It's not only those two options. We actually don't affirm any of those options. We actually say, no, there is a God who's in control of everything, right? And so I think that's what the point is here.
Can I just add to that?
Go ahead.
Just on this question about secularism is sort of malleable and changeable and flexible, whereas religions, or Islam in particular, is fixed. We get that a lot. You're right. We get that in debates around secularism, but also atheist debates, neo-atheism or new atheism. You get this as well. I like to show that it's not true, that there is something fixed about any way of life. You have to have something fixed. Like if you don't have something fixed, you don't have a core, I can't label it. I can't give it a name. Yeah. Right? It won't stick.
Right.
Like if I call something secularism and you say, well, this is flexible, okay, well, tomorrow it could be something else. The name's not going to stick, right? So one way of doing that is to look from an ethical perspective. So if I say, okay, I accept that murder of innocent people is wrong, right? Full stop. Do you think it's a good idea that this possibly can change next year or next week or in 10 years' time? And we might say, you know what? It may be all right if I just walking around in the park and I see a young child and I just kill him because I had a bad day, right? No one's going to accept that idea that malleability on this point is a good thing. It's a bad thing, right? That's just self-evident. Now, you can use various other examples with that. But even away from ethics, if we come to the core of the ideology, as I said, any way of life, any form of governance has to have a core. Liberal secularism has a core. It rests on the idea of autonomy, that human beings are autonomous, freedom, right? For example, the idea of human rights. These ideas are fixed. Like no liberal secularist will say, if I said to them, look, okay, I know you use this idea of human rights, but I want to question this and I want to argue that no human has any rights. So here I'm not talking about the details. I'm not talking about whether, we have this particular right or that particular, but the notion that we have these human rights, which first of all are difficult to substantiate in any eminent worldview. Like where do they come from? If we're not going to ground them in God, where do these rights come from? That's not the point. The point is you have this idea of autonomy, you have this idea of freedom. Can I say to you, you know what? I like the idea of freedom, but let's critique this, and maybe if we critique it hard enough, we'll come with this idea that it's a really bad idea. Freedom's not a good idea. You know what I mean? So that means there is a core. There is some core to secularism, to liberalism, and therefore, again, this is why I keep coming back to the point. This is not a point of distinction. Anytime you're comparing and contrasting to any two things, you want to put your finger on the point of distinction. What's the point of distinction? It's not that we have fixed things and you don't. Yeah, we have different fixed things, and you have different fixed things, but it's not that we have fixed things and you have everything's open to revision. It's not. Rather, we also showed already that it's not about imposition versus not imposition. You also impose, right? And so even with those forms, coming back to this point about French and American and whatnot, I think it's helpful to think about what's common. There is differences. American secularism is big on the Jeffersonian idea of a wall of separation, and Americans get all patriotic when they record this idea that you have to have this wall and independent. The French are interventionist. In India, we have an Indian form of secularism it's a mix of it, right? And liberal secularist theorists will argue that that's a good thing. Sometimes you might have to intervene. Sometimes you'll be different because it's specific to this place. Turkish secularism is probably even more interventionist than French because you have a religious ministry, right? At least the French don't have a religious ministry. It's the secular people doing. They're a bit more open and frank about their intervention. But what's common? I want to argue that what's common in all these forms is the subordination of religion to worldly concerns. Subordination. And that's why secularism is not about separation. It's not about separation. That's a sort of a myth, right? It's a liberal myth. It sounds nice. I'm just asking you to practice your religion as you want, right? And in fact, early liberals like Jefferson and Madison and others, John Locke, argued that we're asking for religion to be put in its proper place, right? Its proper place, because it's about conscience. If the state forces you or influence, that's not religion. How's that religion? Religion is your relationship, your interior relationship with God. It has to come from inside, right? Any state effect or affect that ruins religion. Now, modern liberals won't argue that. Why not? Because that's a theological argument.
Yeah.
We're actually arguing what proper religion is. It's not you as a political theorist, it's not your job to tell us what proper religion is, particularly when you're arguing we want to separate this, right? But come back to my point to end on this note. The common point between American secularism and French and Indian and Turkish, or they also use sort of moderate and hard secularism and soft secularism, moderate versus radical secularism, they all subordinate religion to worldly concerns. It's just that they do so in different ways. Mm-hmm. And in the opposite of that, in pre-modern, most places, in pre-modern life, Christendom, Islamic, was the opposite. It was the subordination of worldly concerns to transcendent concerns, right? That's the Islamic position. But secularism has not sort of come up with a neutral platform and said, you know what, let's put this controversial stuff aside. It's flipped the tables. But it's still engaged in a form of subordination. Now, if you put it like that, you're making it hard for the other side to justify what makes it superior. It's a different form of subordination.
I think before I try to move slightly a little bit towards the subject matter, I think that distinction of this beautification, it's a phrase that almost beautifies what secularism is. It makes it sound very, very empowering when it says, no, it's just a separation of church and state, religion to the state. But obviously, it's a lot more than that. So I think I'm just getting anxious because I know that we've covered a lot about secularism, but if we can take a little bit of a step, if it's too much of a leap, let me know it's too much of a leap and we can come back. So everything we discussed right now, mashallah, it was very, very detailed about secularism and its effects and what levels it has effect to. And so when we talk about who is actually affected by secularism and who can be and who can't be affected by secularism, right? So someone may feel that if someone has devoted their life to religion and that is what they do, how can secularism affect them? Because they're saying they're not affected by secularism. They say they don't believe in secularism. So what are some of the hints that we can find within ourselves as Muslims? Because we want to root this out of our hearts, because some of us may not even know we have secularism within us. So number one, can it be possible that a person who's known as a person of religion or a person of God or a scholar of religion or a scholar of Islam, can they be affected by secularism, by some of the statements that they make, and they may not even realize it? And number two, how do us as lay people, and I know we talked about some of the issues that we may believe in or whatever the case is, but some of us may be operating out of ideas and thoughts and concepts and giving people ideas of solution, but the framework of those ideas may be from secularism. We don't even know it, but we're saying it's from Islam. And we're saying this is Islam's best interest, but it can be the root of all of that is someone who may be affected by secularism, right?
So the main point that, are we unconsciously or subconsciously affected by secularism to the point where we don't even realize it? Because
a lot of people think, let me rephrase this, I apologize. A lot of people believe that secularism is a separation of church and state.
Yeah.
So since a person has engulfed his life in religion, it's impossible for him to be secular because he denies secularism and he believes, for instance, Islam is a complete way of... He thinks he's safe, right? Do you think that, in your opinion, in your experience, Is it possible for somebody of religion, let's just call them somebody of religion, to be operating out of secularism or ideas of secularism? They don't know it.
You want to start with Uthman and then we'll go to Ali? You go ahead, Uthman.
Yeah. So, look, as Ali said at the start, we live in a secular age. Secularism is the hegemonic discourse and the hegemonic form of life of our time. It is very difficult to avoid being affected by it. That doesn't mean you can't. I'll come to that. But I find Ali referred to Charles Taylor. I find his argument compelling that, in fact, Taylor introduces a new way of thinking about secularity, where he says secularity is about how we experience the search for the spiritual, how we experience belief in the world, and leaving the details aside. But a key part of that is when we believe in the modern age, almost all of us believe, I won't say with some doubt, but with knowing that this belief is an option amongst a list of options that I've chosen, but there's always other options out there, right? Whereas if you're living under, I don't know, the Abbasid Caliphate, or if you're living in more so in Christendom, much less plural, 15th, 14th century Christendom, it is the naive belief. Naive here means not stupid or superficial, but you don't have to think much. Everyone does it. God exists. It's clear. It's self-evident.
Yes.
Right? And only widows and sort of people question that. So that flip, everyone's affected by it, right? It's out there. We live with neighbors and people and all sorts of things, and you have to sometimes second guess your thoughts. Sometimes doubts may arise. You have to deal with them. So we all deal with that. And then on the political sphere, where, as Ali said, the formation of subjectivities, which is a fancy way of saying that the state tries to mold how you think, how you live, how you experience the world in the way that is, sort of comports with its, or accords with the consolidation of its power and the proliferation of its power. So we see this from a more practical level. We can see this effect of secularism on all sorts of aspects of Muslim life. Scholarly institutions, education. You can pick up any of our reputable, right, not fringe, reputable institutions of education like Azhar or Zaytuna in Tunisia, not the one in the US. Although I could use that example as well. You could pick them up and you can see how they're teaching a very Islam that's very focused on personal fiqh and ibadat. It's very personal. So it's difficult for graduates from these places to articulate, for example, how Islam manifests itself politically and economically.
Because they weren't given a background on it. Yes.
You know what?
Even though they've come out of a 4-year or 6-year full-time program learning Islam, and every second Muslim will tell you Islam is a comprehensive way of life, something's missing, right?
Yeah.
Something happened in the middle there. So that's one example of many others where the effect is it's very, very widespread.
Yeah, Uthman, before we get to Ali, I just want to piggyback of what you're saying. I think in a lot of ways you can see it on a very personal level. Like when you talk about even this need to be apologetic about certain things we have within Islam, I feel is out of the inferiority complex, because in their mind they're comparing it to what people who are secular are going to say. Well, we don't actually believe that.
That's how powerful that idea is.
You know what I mean? It makes you feel shame about what you actually believe in. For example, that's why people are coming out now, the younger generation, the right to love. What's the problem with being, as long as they're not practicing it openly, as long as they don't really, why are you caring about what they're doing privately in their life? It's their private life, right? These arguments that we hear about all the time, or I'll give you a keyword too. Oh, do you really think that if the Khilafah came back today that we would have like a rajam, or we would have a clash? This is so draconian. These words like draconian is so old.
Well, it's, I think, done more clever than that, Mort. I think that what you're hitting on is the actual root of the issue, because there's just this unease of Muslims wanting to discuss with non-Muslims about our positions regarding Islamic governance. But what's being done is that we can't implement Islam because there's just too much bloodshed. So they don't want to use what you're saying, because that's really hitting on a weak point that Muslims should be embarrassed about. Rather than that, maybe there is some truth to it. Maybe I'm being a little harsh. And do you guys think that there is
No, but continue that point about the bloodshed. What do you mean by that?
Because the implementation of Islam has, over the past few decades, caused so much strife and bloodshed and imprisonment of many, Muslim activists, like Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood,
the past 100 years, okay.
And so on. All the various Muslim movements across the Muslim world have experienced incredible amount of pain and suffering, and what some scholars have said is that, hey, maybe this isn't, in order to avoid all this bloodshed, we just, kind of find a compromise with secularism and say that, hey, it's not necessarily that we're divorcing Islamic governance from life, but we implement some kind of natural model that allows the people to legislate Islam
to lessen the bloodshed.
No. But what their hope is that these people have these Islamic values, and since they're so, it's instilled in them that their natural reaction is to only rule by what Allah would accept. But the problem is that they're still trusting men to decide that it's okay. They're still seeking approval of men to say it's okay that we think this way.
Right.
So with that being that, I want to maybe ask Ali to bring him on and say, well, what is the danger of trying to, I think this is a real gist of the issue here. What danger do we face when we begin to have this conversation and say, well, if we change the mindset of people and get them to think more Islamically, that in turn, their judgment will be according to the book of Kitab Allah wa Sunnah, and so even if it's their choice, it's still in line with what Allah and His Messenger have sent. But again, we're still hoping that they make the right choice. So, Ali, what would you say is like the danger of introducing this type of thought, or I don't want to call it reformist, but this kind of approach that they're maybe now exploring to try to maybe, correct maybe what's not been working in the past? What's the danger that is existential to us if we do that?
So there's this, so there's this emerging idea, right, in the Muslim world that has its origins back from the time of Muhammad Abdo up until today with Rashid al-Ghannouchi and the Turkish model and so forth. It's the idea that rather than thinking about an Islamic state, let us operate and function within the existing public space and try to make an argument and make a case for Islam. Now, the problem with this approach is that it is not critical, right? It assumes that the public space is a sort of level playing field where you have multiple religious actors who are equal in their capacities, and they basically battle it out in this sort of battle of hearts and minds. And then whoever wins and whoever prospers takes enters this neutral state, right, with its neutral institutions and so forth, and then can implement Islamic values and ideas. The reality is that there is no neutral civil or civic state through which this sort of battle for the hearts and minds operates. The state is always based on a certain, call it an ideology, call it a worldview, call it a theology, and whatever. The state always operates through power. The state does not resign itself or does not disassociate itself with the use of power. So this assumption, this idea that, let's just battle it out, right, in the public space, is to already accept and concede to a state which masquerades and which tries to present itself as being a neutral state, but in reality it is a state which has its own agenda and which is also actively involved in the process of shaping the hearts and the minds. And what we saw with the Arab Spring, or even earlier before, we saw that we saw a perfect case in point of how the state is not neutral, how the secular state, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the Middle East, or whether it's in France, is not neutral, and it is not a guarantee of social prosperity and tolerance, but rather that the state in and of itself could not accommodate these Islamic movements. So it had to repress them. right? It had to repress them. So despite this argument being made by those very same Islamic movements that the nation state is a neutral arbiter of ideas, that very same nation state repressed them and marginalized them.
So it doesn't exist, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's funny because just on that note too, you'll find certain groups that will, and I think this is also a big problem now. What we're seeing now, the development of it, is that they're realizing that people are being forced to choose. They're waking up to the idea that, especially, this is one good thing that these critical theories have brought about, is that maybe what we've been taught isn't always the right thing. Now, I'm not saying I agree with critical theories. I have my issues with them. But it's certainly challenging the normative view, right? And so they're realizing that people are looking to the alternatives, right, rather than what is there. So what is the counterbalance here now? Well, if they're going to look to Islam or other ideas, let's prop up a group of the Muslims that share our values and call them Muslim. I mean, like the title of practicing Muslims, or their individual labels they give them. So when they want to look for something else, they see, well, wait a minute. You know, they're Muslims and they have Islam. They're very much Muslim, at least in look, but they agree with what the secular principles are, right? They believe that, you should have freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of expression and choice and all these things. And that's, for me, the most dangerous thing. Because what you're doing is you're putting a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're saying, look, I'm Muslim too. I'm wearing a hijab. I have a beard. I'm a sheikh. I'm a student of knowledge. X, Y, you put in there, right? But I co-sign this. If I can do it, you can do it too.
That's pretty deep, Mort. That is.
Yes, very good point. Very good point, yeah.
We're getting real over here, gentlemen.
No, I mean, it's just the reality.
No, I like this.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was going to be this serious. I thought we were going to get a little goofy, but this is good. Let's keep it like this. Is there a possibility, like, you can pull up the post soon if it's not too much trouble?
No, because, it's not. The episode wasn't meant specifically for the Sheikh's post,
Okay.
but because there's many other people who are saying the same thing, and I don't want it to seem like
He's the only,
we're ganging up on him.
I actually wanted to. So the reason why I asked
to be fair though, I think he's trying to work within those people who are saying that, like trying to make some kind of bridge. I'm not saying I agree with it, but he's not the source of it all. Yeah. It's been coming here. It's snowballing, and now people are being forced to have to deal with it, and they're trying to find a way to deal with it.
Yeah. No, and the reason why I brought up the thing about the scholars and Muslims is that my personal way of looking at this, I hope I'm correct, inshallah, is that there's so much pull, there's so much power and strength, not in a good way, in a very negative way, about some of these ideas, especially secularism and even liberalism and democracy, or the false notion or understanding of democracy, is that people are so affected by it, they don't realize that it's affecting them. And they don't realize when they say something that how much it's actually telling about where Islamic scholarship is going, right? And like that post that, look, while I was reading the post, and many other people I've read of similar things, I'm not 100% blaming them. I actually feel very, very sorry for them, right? Because they're my brothers, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's so disheartening, because what they're saying, literally in my heart, it really, when I saw that from him and many other people, it really breaks your heart, because you see and you know how much you love Allah, and you know how much they love Allah. And for us, Allah is the end all be all, right?
Yeah.
And they're not realizing that when they're using, like, some of the things, if I can use some of the examples, is that it's like, there's like this emotional and intolerant youth and the way they think, and it becomes very oppressive, and it becomes like, I'm going to say this like straightforward, like, I actually disagree when Muslims say that if there is a khilafah, all of our problems are going to be solved. I actually tell people not to say that, because it is not going to solve all of our problems. We talk about establishing Islam because it's a fard, and because that's what Allah's expectation is. If it does solve some problems, alhamdulillah.
I see what you're saying.
Look, Rasulullah, sorry to cut you off, Rasulullah, he said, when he talked about Yawm al-Qiyamah, there's so many places of the Quran where Allah alludes to how close Yawm al-Qiyamah is, and Muhammad saying that Yawm al-Qiyamah is this close, right? If you talk about rulership and the bloodshed that occurred amongst Muslims who claimed to be implementing Islam, that for us doesn't have a bearing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he expects from us in this world. That's just a result of whether you want to call it bloodshed sides of the Yawm al-Qiyamah and all that kind of stuff, right? And rulership and kingdom and monarchs and whatever it be said, right? And Rasulullah never made a guarantee that as soon as you implement Islam, everything is going to be perfect. That's what Jannah is for. That's Jannah, right?
So before you go on, I just want to make sure people don't misconstrue this point. It's an important point. Yeah. It's not to say that there's no benefit in Khilafah, but any benefit that we have is a fadl from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that the reason why we want it is because it's a command to establish this. Yes. Whether we can... If something good or bad, what we perceive may come from it, it's irrelevant. Yeah. And the reason I mention this point is because the posts and many other posts, they make people look like they're backwards, barbarians, they're simple thinkers when they're talking about this thing about the Khilafah or the establishment of Islam. And that's the part that hurts me the most, because what that tells me, and I'm not talking about anybody in specific now, they didn't realize what the purpose of Muhammad's prophethood was. So that's what stings the most. So you're saying they're looking to get a gain, what stings the most, not the command. Yes, but that's where the secularism thing comes in now, is because, and I'm just going to simplify this, is yes, Muhammad the thing that made this all beautiful is his akhlaq were amazing, but that wasn't the point of his prophethood. To bring family ties and destroy monarchies, those are all beautiful, right? And doing his tahajjud, all of the tahajjud and the beautiful purification of soul things make a lot more sense to you when you understand what his purpose was, and that was establishing Allah's deen on this earth. It was Adam alayhi salam's role from the first prophet and the final prophet. That's what the role was. Everything else that he did in the process was a means to show how amazing Allah is. Right? But his main purpose was to establish Allah's deen on this earth, and after that, that's where the spread of Islam began, and then he passed away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Yeah. But it hurts me when somebody says, "Oh, it's just this thing. It's a figment of their imagination. They're simple-minded people. Yeah. They don't understand the deen. They think the deen is just this and this." I was like, to me, it's like, dude, how much do you understand the deen, man, for saying this? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So that I think is a very, very important thing to focus on, how that. And that's why I loved it when Sim sent a message and said that you want to talk about secularism regarding all of this, because it's going to clarify all of these issues. Because the mindset has to be that if this person is adopting secularism, then it doesn't make sense for him to establish Islam, for people to be governed by in the first place. Yeah, that's like, like I remember one brother we were talking to back in the day, right? He was like, "Oh, you want some Khalifa to come on a white horse and a sword, and everyone's going to be practicing Islam," right? Somebody said that to us back in the day, right? And it's like, this person was a Islamically educated person, an imam of a masjid. Yeah. Now, if the imam in the masjid is speaking that way to people, right, it's very disheartening, right? Yeah. Because what is actually going to come out of this? Yeah, it's cool to tell people to pray all the time. That's a part of it. But Muhammad ﷺ's goal was not just purification of the soul stuff, right? We can't limit it to that.
It wasn't focused on just the individual unit of society. It was focused macro and micro. Yeah. So on every layer of society, however you want to imagine it, or however you want to define what a society is, Islam superseded or imposed its values and its paradigm onto each layer. Yeah. Whether,
Can I say something here?
Of course.
I agree. I think it's a very good point to reassert some of the fundamentals of Islam. That, since we're speaking about the effects of secularism, sometimes even those fundamentals are no longer taken to be sort of self-evident fundamentals. Having said that, and I also agree that sometimes when these public figures, mashayikh, others, they use these caricatures that the other side is very simpleton, naive, they haven't thought about this. I think that's very problematic. At the same time, I think we want to avoid sort of raising caricatures in return. Of course. So, for example, people like Sheikh Hatim al-Hajj, since his post we're talking about only representatively, there are many others. It's not just about him, but definitely he's not someone who doesn't understand the deen, doesn't understand the fundamentals of the deen. He's a very erudite and very a person of deep knowledge in Islam, as far as I know, and it's very, very sincere. And I think these type of proposals are coming from a place of sincerity and from a place of knowledge, but that doesn't guarantee that there's no issues with it, and that's why it's open to discussion. And what I like about him. He's open to some of this critical feedback and discussion. What I would say is that some people like him and other mashayikh and other people who are not mashayikh either, they're trying to deal with some of the issues pragmatically. It is difficult to navigate our modern situation. I think we have to accept that. It's difficult. We're starting on the back foot, at least politically, economically. We've had an experience of a number of decades now of various attempts to forward, quote unquote, an Islamist agenda that overall has failed, I think. That doesn't mean there hasn't been various benefits and various battles haven't been won. They have, but overall we're still in a situation of deciding, what is it we need to do? What's the best way forward? So I think with all that in mind, what people like this are trying to do is come up with a pragmatic way of dealing with this. My issue with it, my critique of it, there is sometimes it comes across as not even pragmatic. Like you're trying to do that, but first of all, you're missing on certain aspects, like understanding what secularism is, right? Like understanding that you can't have a neutral space, and therefore to try and assert that we're going to work towards a form of Islamic or Sharia compliant governance where the people are sovereign, but because they're Muslim, we hope or we expect for them to do so. You may expect that, but then that's not Islamic governance, right? First of all, that's not how politics or governance works. We're waiting for the people to do that, but that hasn't been the understanding of Islamic governance for 1300 years, right? Islamic governance is applying Islam to the best of our ability. It's not allowing the people to agree or disagree with various aspects of Islam and non-Islam. That's democracy, right? So I think it's important to bring out the tensions in these suggestions. Sheikh Hatem, in his case, he was very reticent to accept that what he's calling for is effectively secularism. He wanted to say, no, this is not secularism, it's not democracy, this is Islamic, right? So, however, the details of what he's saying are very difficult to differentiate from. That's what democracy is. People are sovereign, right? It's just that in America, you don't expect them to accept Islam. In America, they're liberal or they're Christian or whatever, but you're putting your hope in the fact that these people are Muslim and that therefore they will accept Islam. And at the same time, he's saying, well, our people don't really understand Sharia completely. They have a very general and vague understanding. So then it doesn't even match up. So I think some of those tensions bringing it out is important, but definitely it's coming from a place of sincerity, from a place of knowledge.
Of course.
And these are some of the discussions we're going to have in a brotherly way.
I have deep respect for Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj and many others that even in the scholar class that say things like that. And I when I say that, it breaks your heart, not in the sense that I have a vendetta against them, in a sense that they're such valuable human beings and they've been affected by, if you want to call this virus or this pandemic, right? It affects lots and lots of people. And sometimes when they say something, it comes off as very condescending too. Like these people, they can't comprehend what the Sharia is. But one other thing that I was really, really thinking about is, it's as simple as, in my mind, on the face value, it looks like there may be some people who don't think that Islamic governance is a fard. It seems like that to me. Somebody who lives in the community, somebody who knows people very well, that it seems like, okay, it's just something that it's good to have, but we're doing well without it, kind of thing. And I see that within lots of people talk. It's like the one thing that I hear most is, man, Mahdi is going to come and take care of all this. We have nothing to worry about, which is fine. It's cool to understand that and believe that.
But right? Even then, you're still accepting.
You are
the fundamental premise.
You got it.
Yeah.
You've already you've been defeated to something.
Yeah. And
you're willing to sit on your whatever,
and just wait
and wait. Yeah. But the other thing is that it is what it is. That was a time that occurred before, and whatever Allah has planned for us is going to happen. That's beautiful too. It's good that you could think like that, right? But we need to step up that game a little bit, right? And raise awareness, at least raise awareness that establishing Allah's deen is fard.
But not just that. No, one thing. I'm sorry to interrupt you guys. one thing I noticed so many times is that there's an aversion to bloodshed for change. Like throughout history, whenever there's tumultuous times in history, change is happening or affecting many different regions over the course of a millennia. There's going to be violence. There's going to be bloodshed.
Always,
You can't say that I'm going to make a compromise with a system of values that is completely or diametrically opposite to Islam, and say that, oh, this is because I want to prevent violence and bloodshed. Yeah. You have to accept that this is change will require sacrifice, and it's not necessarily we don't know the type of sacrifice that's required, but
it may not be blood, but it's possible.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
just look at even the secular system.
With the kind of government we have.
I mean, just look at Iraq, Afghanistan, what they try to do in the world, South America, even the secular system.
It's the price of democracy.
Yeah, but it requires blood. That's why they call them fallen soldiers, right? They say our soldiers went out there and spread the democracy and democratic values. They parade them, right? But before I know Ali was taking some notes. I want to go to him. But before I do that, I think one of the most important takeaways from this conversation should be for the average Joe listening is that you should never be ashamed of the fact that Islam has a counter argument. And our argument, whether people agree with that or not, is irrelevant to us, right? It is there. And we have conviction in that this is correct. Like, for example, if I walk around, you should know that Islam has solutions the same way you know the sky is blue. It doesn't matter if someone comes to me and tells me it's not blue. It might be subjective. It may be blue-green. I don't care. It's blue, right? I know Islam is correct. I know what Allah and His Messenger said is correct. Yeah. Whether you believe it or not is irrelevant to me. All right? I don't need to apologize for feeling that way that, hey, I only want to live under Islam. Yeah. This is my dream. This is my feeling. Yeah. Because it's rooted in yaqeen and something. And this is what I feel like Muslims today, how secularism has made them question that feeling that they should have.
Yeah. But when you say that, they think that you're saying that because it's going to be a utopian society.
No.
Listen, I'm agreeing with you. They say, oh, he's just saying that, and that's where they come with the counter arguments. Oh, look at all the Islamic history. Look at all this Muslim history. Look at everything that happened. What you're saying is not. I'm not want to live there because I think I'm going to be living in luxury and I'm going to have this and that.
Can I make a point about that?
I just want to be amongst those people who can witness that I lived where Allah's deen is being implemented.
Yeah. Before I go to Ali, I want to make a point about this because you reminded me of something which is quick. So, you know, remember during the original Egyptian Thawra, the revolution, Tahrir Square, right? I remember this one scene that had me mind blown. Now, I'm not saying the Ikhwan did everything perfect. They have their own issues, you know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive them for mistakes, whatever, but their intention is noble. Regardless of that, but I remember there was one scene where there was this Muslim woman, Egyptian woman, she was sitting there without hijab, and she's protesting. And you can see in the middle of all the chaos happening, all this thing happening, but she's saying, I want them to come because I need someone to tell me to wear hijab. I need someone to force this hijab on me. We can't do it ourselves. You know what I mean? Like that to me, it shocked me. Meaning that there's a need for this. They know it. I mean, there are certain people who just, like, it's not that we have to force them, but what they're calling for is this environment that's conducive for you to come back to this fitrah of yours.
I see what you're saying.
Right. So I want to go to Ali. I know you two are taking notes, and I know you had a lot to say, so I just want to come back to you, inshallah. Faddal, Ali.
Barakallahu feek. So let me preface what I'm going to say about the post by making the disclaimer that given the Sheikh's, of course, the sincerity of the Sheikh and his knowledge, that doing justice to the post and to his arguments would require a session in and of itself. But building on what Uthman was saying, right, that essentially this represents a more pragmatic approach that scholars and some Muslim activists have been putting forth about how to navigate the place of Muslims in the modern world. Now, the problem with this pragmatic approach is that it in and of itself is also not critical, right? So you'll find that those who espouse pragmatism will criticize Islamists for not being critical. But the reality is that this pragmatic approach is too optimistic and lacks the critical thinking that it assumes that it has. So, for example, this idea that we need to accommodate our times, right? This idea that we have to change with the times, right? It seems to me as though we're conflating our time with we're conflating a secular time, a secular age, with time, with our current age, or we're conflating reality with a secular order, and so forth, right? So when we say that we want to accommodate reality, we have to accommodate the times. What exactly are we accommodating? Are we accommodating a natural progression, a natural world order, wherein Muslims live in an equal footing to non-Muslims, and Muslims have political representation, and there's no bloodshed, and there's no fitna? Or are we essentially accommodating a secular order, right? So what do we mean when we say that we need to accommodate the times, that we need to accommodate reality? And this idea of accommodating reality is even found its way into modern Islamic thought. So in the Muslim world, we have this idea of fiqh al-waqi'. You know how we say like the jurisprudence of marriage? Now there's this idea of the jurisprudence of reality, which is all about how do we accommodate reality. And they try to frame reality as being this sort of natural progression. They try to frame it as though the way things are. This is ordinary. This is the new normal. But this is not the new normal, right? This is one particular order, a secular order that has imposed itself at the level of a world system. So again, this pragmatic approach has to critically reassess itself and ask, what exactly is it that you are being pragmatic towards? And what exactly is it that you are asking us to accommodate? Is it normalcy, or is it a way of being, and is it a global order, which for Muslims is a fitna?
Uthman, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just
we can also. I want to tie this point, back to the point of violence, because that's a very good point. Like there's two sides to the violence coin as well. If you try to change the order, that may sometimes require some violence, and obviously Islamically we ought to minimize that. And also as a side point, obviously in the secular world, if you have to spill blood for democracy, that's a great thing. No. They have to spill blood for something else, and so it's not the blood, right? It's the means justifies the ends kind of thing. But my point is, when you try to challenge the order, there's a cost to that. But when you compromise with that order, it's not as if there's no violence. The reason we're thinking about changing is because the order is violent in the first place. Right. So if I compromise with that and he just stays around and I do some cosmetic changes and we enter the parliament, what do you think's still happening in the dungeons? Yeah. What is still happening with all the forms of violence that the modern nation state proliferates domestically and overseas? It's still there.
Yeah. The violence, right? It's just for a different cause.
It's
it's
just for a different cause. It's the audacity that the cause of violence is the quote-unquote Ikhwani fault. Yeah, Ikhwani.
They're enticing it. They're the reason for the response.
They're the reason they're dying.
Yeah.
They're the reason they're getting tortured.
Yeah. If they just
instead of saying that the regimes are oppressive and the regimes don't allow,
they would say if you just behave
sort of the other way around
and civilly, nothing would happen to you. You'd have this peaceful life. But the alternative is not that, right? Which, like you've mentioned, you could be living in a secular state and then be required to be drafted into war. You have no business fighting. Right? The idea, the notion that it's less violent is just it's a false premise. It's an assumption that's based in a fairy tale idea that it makes you feel comfortable. If we take all it is less confrontational.
You know what it is? It reminds me of I read a lot about mental health lately.
You do?
I heard about it's actually a very narcissist attitude. These regimes have blamed the abused for their own abuse. Right? Isn't that
exactly
what narcissists do?
Yeah.
But
on a quick note, I was listening to Ali. Yeah,
inside joke in that.
Absolutely. Too we'll talk about it. No, but I'm thinking I was listening to Ali speaking, and Ali, what reminded me of the whole time thing is there's a saying in Arabic, al-hal la tadun, meaning it'll never. The time, it doesn't last I mean, it'll change. Nothing lasts forever. And so the fact that you're basing your Islam and everything based on something that's happening currently. Think about this. Their powers have been, here for a couple hundred years? It's nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine, I'll give you a small example before we give you guys to close up your thought. But imagine when Al-Quds was lost. And if they would have thought, you know what, we're just going to compromise now. 100 years, God, we're never going to get it back. Never.
Yeah.
Right? And then, but within 100 years, Allah causes the whole thing to change.
Yeah. The whole world changed. Yeah.
Right? And so nothing lasts forever. Everything is by the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the idea that we should adjust because this is as we're acting as if this is the static condition we're going to continue to be in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A very shallow way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
That's all.
Any closing
Uthman,
thoughts?
Any closing thoughts, Uthman?
Uthman or Ali? Before
No,
we
I think
wrap
I
up?
said what it is.
Ali?
I think you're right also that we need to initiate the change, right? We shouldn't naturalize this order. And you'll find that a lot of the things, this comes back to the point about how there's subconscious or sometimes conscious interpolation of secular ideas. Part of the secularist imagination is that this is natural. This is the right order. This is, religion, superstition, all this dogma. When it falls away, you get secularism, natural. And so we have to avoid naturalizing these things, understanding that they are contingent, right? They are contingent. And therefore, our role is to initiate change. Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. Ironically, some people use that ayah to push for a secular understanding of individual change. But the point is, we have to initiate the change in the direction that Allah wants it, and that for this purpose, for the end of seeking His pleasure, and things will happen, as you said with the crusade. So we ought not to naturalize any of this. We ought to be critical, and may Allah change our condition for the best.
Right? Yes.
Ali?
Exactly. I mean, exactly what Uthman said. At the end of the day, we have to remember that we belong to an ummah. And, in Arabic, the word ummah means that which follows. So what defines an ummah is that it has a direction, that it has an image of itself, that it has a vision. And we cannot retain a direction and vision if we remain imprisoned. And like Uthman said, if we naturalize fitna, if we naturalize the secular age. So in order for us to live up to being part of the Muslim Ummah and having a direction and having our own vision in the world, we need to have the courage, inshallah ta'ala, to think critically about secularism, to think critically about the secular age, and inshallah ta'ala have the resolve to change, make the changes necessary.
Inshallah. On that note, there's so much more we could talk about, but we're going to probably have to do another session at some point.
Please, I feel like we just got
unpackaging
started.
more ideas about why certain Muslim countries, even though they have the power to change, the reasons as to why they don't change, right? I mean, meaning that there's certain Muslim power countries that have the ability to not implement secularism, but they do. And I think maybe at a later point we can talk about why that is, like what the influences are, how this is spreading from an individual level to this collective level. And we should talk about that maybe at a later point, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Folks, first, thank you, Ali and Uthman, for joining tonight. I know it's weird times for you guys, but for the listeners, please like and subscribe, and make sure you comment in the comment section below and let us know your thoughts about this episode. Do you believe in secularism, or do you think that we can't? It's an unescapable reality that we're living in. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section.
If you don't like it, you're anti-Khilafah.
We'll have some fun with
and
it.
never comment again in the comment section. No, always comment.
Yeah. Help us out on patreon.com/the Mad Mamluks. Alternatively, you can go to themadmamluks.com/donate and help us out through PayPal. For my co-hosts and our esteemed guests, Uthman and Ali, my name is Sim. We'll see y'all next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.